everybody. We thank you so much for coming out and for your support. For those who don't know, I am Anna Daly, the kind of newly elected president of the Perth Amboy Free Public Library Board of Trustees. And in conjunction with the director, with the staff, the other municipal entities within the city, we are trying to keep this historic building afloat. And as you notice, we've worked, took us some time to renovate the building, and we're not finished, but we've made a lot of progress with it. And again, on behalf of the Library Board of Trustees, thank all of you for coming. And as you know, the primary focus tonight is in recognition of the Thomas Mundy Peterson accomplishments, achievements, his place, his status in history. Bring attention to that. Let people know who he was, what he did, and to celebrate his act. And I am also on the Historic Preservation Commission, if my chairperson doesn't mind me saying it back there. Hope I'm not overstepping my bounds. But he has appointed me to co-chair the Thomas Mundy Peterson project under the Historic Preservation Commission. And I am also on the Mayor's Strategic Planning Task Force, and I'm under the section for tourism and historic preservation. So with all of those entities, hopefully we can bring a lot of attention to the history and the positive things of Perth Amboy, including Thomas Mundy Peterson. And when I started the project of researching information, because being a former educator, you know, we have to document what we say and make sure that it is true and correct. I started looking up information, and almost everywhere I looked, I kept seeing the name Gordon Bond. Okay, I look here, I saw Gordon Bond. Look here, I saw, well, who is this Gordon Bond? I was fortunate enough to go to an event during the summer where he was one of the presenters, and I got to see who Gordon Bond was. I got to hear him. And we really owe him a lot of gratitude, thankfulness for his research, his work, bringing a lot of this information together and bringing it to us. He is a historian, and as you can see in your program, if you look there on page 2, I think it is, it's part of the Garden State Legacy. He has his own business where he promotes historical information, historical facts. And again, a lot of the information that we are using to promote the history of Thomas Mundy Peterson comes from Gordon Bond. So we are fortunate enough, blessed enough this evening to have, as they say, quote unquote, I'm from the South, bring it to you from the horse's mouth. Gordon Bond is going to describe to you, explain to you, present to you more in-depth information on Thomas Mundy Peterson and his research, what he does and what he has done, and he has authenticated so much of, well, most of all of the stuff that he has. So we are indebted so much in many ways to Mr. Gordon Bond.
Well, good evening.
Good evening.
How are you doing tonight? All right. So I recognize a bunch of you here. I know that you have seen the other presentation that I give about Thomas Mundy Peterson, about all the things that had to come together in order to make it possible for him to have voted, the whole reason why we are here this evening. When Velma was kind enough to invite me to speak here tonight, I decided that I wanted to do something a little bit different because a lot of people have already heard my talk. I'm not just going to give the same one that I've given, you know, a dozen times before. This talk really picks up where the last one sort of left off. So we talked about how Peterson came to cast his vote, but now what came next? What did he do after he had cast his vote, his post-vote life? So let's start off with the obvious part. On March the 31st, 1870, here in Perth, Amboy, New Jersey, 147 years ago this very day, the man we know as Thomas Mundy Peterson. And I say it that way because at the time he was either known as Thomas Mundy or as Thomas Peterson. Thomas Mundy Peterson is how kind of combining all the names years later, but his actual name was Thomas Henry Peterson. I don't know how many of you knew that, but that was his real name. Well, yes. His real name was Thomas Henry Peterson, but in any event, I wanted to spell one of the mistakes that a lot of people make when they talk about Thomas Peterson and his vote. And I've seen this multiple times, various references. They talk about him being the first African American to vote in the United States, full stop. Okay? That's technically not true. And the reason why we know that is when you look at the early state constitutions that were written at the formation of this country, a lot of them did not have qualifications that said you had to be white or even male. So we know that even men and black men and women were allowed to vote. If we look at the state constitution, this is for New Jersey, okay, the state constitution 1776, that all inhabitants of this colony of full age, you gotta be old enough, who are worth 50 pounds proclamation money, clear estate in the same, in other words, you have some kind of vested interest in the community, and have resided in the county in which they claim to vote for 12 months immediately preceding the election. In other words, if you live here, you can vote. What's missing from this is any qualification that says you have to be white, you have to be a man. And we know that both free blacks and women voted in New Jersey and in some of the other states. Now, this was corrected in the subsequent constitution, or state constitution, and it would take, you know, many years before that was fixed. But so, okay, if Thomas Peterson was not technically the first black man to vote in America, what is so special about his vote? Why are we here today celebrating this 147 years later? In order to really appreciate what this means, I'm going to take you all the way back to the Declaration of Independence. Now, this is the line, this is the bit that hopefully you all know, and hopefully you may have even seen this, you know, in school. Do they still have civics classes anymore? I don't even know. We hold these truths self-evident to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is the line that we all have memorized, we all know, right? The one we are interested in, however, is the line that follows that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This is an important concept. In a democracy, the legitimacy of government is derived from the consent of the governed. Yet, for the first near century of this country's existence, there was no federal definition of what it meant to be a citizen, what it meant to vote. Now, that consent that they're talking about here in a democracy is peaceably given or rescinded through the ballot box. This is an important point, and yet this was not codified in the federal constitution, okay? It was left up to the states. So that meant that the states could say, because you're a black woman, you don't get to vote. Because you're a black man, you don't get to vote. Because you're a white woman, you don't get to vote. Because you don't have enough money, you don't get to vote. Okay? All of this changed as a result of the American Civil War. So this is, we talk about Thomas Peterson voting on the 15th Amendment. In order to understand the 15th Amendment, you actually have to look at the previous two. This is a set. This is they're known as the Reconstruction Amendments. This is the legislative outcome of the American Civil War. So 13th Amendment, 1864, this abolishes slavery. Nearly 4 million people who had formerly been slaves are now free. Great, congratulations. Now what are you? Are you a citizen? Can you enter into a contract? Can you marry? Can you vote? What is your status under a law? This was left as an open question. That had to be resolved by the 14th Amendment in 1868. This finally, at last, defined citizenship. So it says if you're born here, you're a citizen, which by this point, everybody who was freed by the 13th Amendment, they were born here. Yes. Because the slave trade the importation of slaves from outside the United States had been abolished in order to protect the internal slave trade. So by this point, by the middle of the 1800s, if you were a slave and you were in the United States, you were born here. So by defining citizenship by birth, you're effectively giving everyone who is freed under the 13th Amendment saying, you're now a citizen. And of course also by naturalization, by going through a naturalization process. It also meant that there was the concept of equal protection under law. Meaning that you, as a citizen, if you are considered a citizen under the 14th Amendment, you have equal protection under law. You have, you can go to the law for redress of grievances. You have equal access to the legal system, all of these things. That's the theory. Now, suffrage is still not part of this equation, okay? The southern states, the Confederate states, you know, you can free the slaves, you can do all these things. It doesn't necessarily change people's attitudes, okay? So in the South, what was going on is Jim Crow laws, you know, we're going to make it as difficult as possible for freed black people to vote. And that was a problem for multiple reasons. So the 15th Amendment, that was the one that finally redressed that shortcoming that said that suffrage is a defining feature of citizenship. And that's a very important concept. So let's take a look at this thing they call the 15th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. For the first time in American history, the right to vote was being guaranteed by the federal Constitution of the United States of America. For nearly 100 years, that was not the case. I like to point out that we acknowledge Thomas Peterson for all the obvious reasons. This was an important point in civil rights history. And yet, technically, the first person who happened to be in line that day, who would have been a white man, who voted, technically they made history too, because again, this is the first time in American history that anybody, any citizen, voted with the full guarantee and protection of the United States Constitution. That had never happened before. I don't know who that guy was. I would like to know. I think it'd be very interesting to compare and contrast his life with Thomas Peterson's life and see, you know, I think that would be a very interesting study. I don't know who that is, but that is the significance of Peterson's vote. It's not just that he was the first, it was that he was the first to do it under the 15th Amendment of the Constitution. That's an important caveat. So here's the 15th Amendment. This is the process by which it became law. It was approved by the House of Representatives February the 25th, 1869, approved by the Senate the following day. Now, constitutional amendments need to be ratified by 3/4 of the states in order to become law. That occurred on March 30th, 1870, 147 years ago yesterday. And by luck, Perth, Amboy, New Jersey happened to have a referendum election the next day. And this is the election that Thomas Peterson got to vote in. And again, I want to stress that this is important for civil rights history, for voting rights history, and it happened right here in Perth, Amboy, New Jersey. That's something to be very proud of. It's also worth pointing out that while 3/4 of the states had ratified it, New Jersey was not among them. February the 15th, 1871, we finally got around to ratifying it. Okay, so Thomas Mundy Peterson, Thomas Henry Peterson, he got to vote on March the 31st. Now what? He could have voted, cast his ballot, went back to work, disappeared into history as a mere footnote. But he didn't. To me, this is as important as his vote is. This is the part of the history that fascinates me. The reason being is that the opportunity to be the first African-American voter under the 15th Amendment was a matter of dumb luck. He was in the right place at the right time. Now, granted, there were people in the community who supported this and so on, and there is all that backstory. But it was through no effort of his own. Right place, right time. But what he did after that, how he embraced the concept of civic life, that's on him. And that speaks to him as an individual, him as a man, him as a citizen of the United States, and how he embraced that. Now, there are certain aspects of his post-vote life that get repeated, regurgitated, I like to say. Usually a brief mention, not a lot of detail, and no citation of sources, okay? And these are the things that are coming up now, especially when people want to memorialize Peterson. They want to have plaques and plant trees and do all of these things. If you're at the wonderful event that John Dyke had this afternoon, you know, and I've had people come to me and say, well, can you confirm that this happened or that happened, who was the first this or the first that? In some cases I can, in some cases I can't. Not necessarily because they're not true, but just because I don't have the evidence yet, and it may be forthcoming. So this talk, in effect, is a work in progress. And what I'm sharing with you tonight is my research to date. This is the stuff that I figured out up to now. And if anybody out there has any kind of other, and you in particular, has any kind of information to expand on that, I'd be more than happy to hear you. So these are the things that we're going to be talking about tonight. Member of Charter Revision Committee. This is something that puzzled me. It didn't make sense to me. You have a...
Can we ask some questions as we go along, or do you want to wait until you finish?
Let's wait till I'm finished.
Okay.
Thank you. So, member of a Charter Revision Committee. This did not make sense to me when I looked at his vote, what he was voting about, what he said about it, didn't match what I was seeing in the record. And this puzzled me, and this is something I had to figure out. So, the origins of it are from this publication. This is in 1960. Now, when Thomas Peterson died in 1904, he did not have a grave marker. In 1960, a group of citizens got together, and the slab that is now there on his grave in St. Peter's Church, you can go there and see it. Well, it's dark now, but you can go on a nicer day and see it. That slab was dedicated in 1960. One of the people that spearheaded this was William McGinnis, the gentleman here. He was a school superintendent. He was a local historian. He wrote a bunch of books about, or pamphlets and articles about Perth Amboy history. This is the guy who was really behind it. So this is a program that was issued to go along with the dedication of this marker to on Peterson's grave. And in this description of Peterson's life, he describes a newspaper clipping in the possession of Mrs. Johann Garretson Coyne, without date. So we don't know what newspaper, we don't know when it was published. That reports an interview with Thomas Peterson. And this is worth reading, if only because this is Peterson describing his vote in his own words. I was working for Mr. J.L. Carney on the morning of the day of the election and did not think of voting until he came out to the stable where I was attending to the horses and advised me to go to the polls and exercise a citizen's privilege. When I went home to dinner at noon, I met Mr. Marcus Spring of Eagleswood, a place about a mile out of town, and he too advised me to claim the right of suffrage at the polls. If you were at my last talk, you know who those people are. If you don't, show up at my next talk. He goes on to describe the voting experience itself. As I advanced to the polls, one man offered me a ticket bearing the words revised charter, and another one marked no charter. Now, what was going on here in Perth Amboy is that the city charter, they had revised the city charter. And they were asking the citizens of Perth Amboy, do you accept this revised charter? Or do you want to give up the charter? There was talk about going to a township form of government. That was the question of the day, okay? So Peterson says, I thought I would not vote to give up the charter after holding it so long, so I chose a revised charter ballot. Our side won the election by a vote of 230 to 63. And I may mention, as a coincidence, that I was afterwards appointed one of a committee of 7 to revise the charter. This is the sentence that didn't make sense to me. Okay, I was afterwards appointed one of the committee of 7 to revise the charter. Okay, why didn't this make sense to me? If you go into the legislative record for the state of New Jersey, you find this. This is an act to revise the charter of the city of Perth Amboy. It is the city charter already revised. Okay, the city charter already revised, and it says at the end that this act shall take effect immediately upon the charter being duly declared accepted by such a majority vote. They're talking about the election in which Thomas Peterson voted. Approved March 17, 1870, before Peterson voted. So what is he revising? If the charter is already revised and it's being accepted by the majority vote, and so it's therefore duly declared accepted as the charter of the city of Perth Amboy. Where does this committee of 7 and Peterson revising something come into play? I found the record of the Perth Amboy City Council. These were transcribed in the 1930s under a WPA project. If you're interested in seeing these are in the Alexander Library Special Collections. I've gone through these. And this is talking about the election. This is the election results. This is what they said. Resolved that the said results be hereby published, and that said act declared to be the charter of the city of Perth Amboy in full force and effect from this day. But that sounds like a done deal, doesn't it? Right? I mean, I'm not crazy here, right? This sounds like there was a revised charter. They voted on it. They accepted it. So again, where does Peterson and his committee of 7 come into play? I found no other references to the charter in any of the city records going forward. Go through the pages, there ain't nothing there. What I did find, though, was this. This is in the state legislature. This is a supplement to an act entitled An Act to Amend the Charter of the City of Perth Amboy. Actually, let me go back here. So apparently, there were changes that still needed to be made. Even though it had been approved, there were still some tweaks that they wanted to make to it. So for example, they talked about changing the mayor and council of, striking that out and replacing it with the city of Perth Amboy, the corporation of the city of Perth Amboy. Certain things had to be tweaked, still tweaked and changed, even though it had been approved. And if you go to the end here, that this act shall take effect immediately, approved April 5th, 1871. So that means sometime between March 31st, 1870 and April 5th, 1871, a committee of 7 people was convened in order to make the changes that were approved here. and Thomas Peterson was part of that process. So now suddenly it makes sense. However, because I can find no record of it in the city council minutes or in newspapers, I find no reference to it. I don't know who were the other 6 people on the committee with him. I don't know, there was no report from this committee to the city council. I don't know what Thomas Peterson's contributions were to this process. There's not, it's just this gap. We know what happened, it makes sense now, but this is one of those holes that we have in Thomas Peterson's story. Political convention delegate, this is an interesting one. So, the reference for this comes from that same newspaper article that McGinnis had referenced in that program for the dedication of the Peterson Memorial over his grave. And this is Peterson talking. He says, "For 7 years, I was employed by the city as a janitor of the public schools, and last year I was a delegate to the Republican County Convention." So this is Peterson in his own words, so we know it happened. We know he was a delegate to a political convention because he's telling us he was a delegate to a political convention. It'll be interesting to know what convention, what election. In order to understand that, we need to know when this article, which is unidentified, unattributed, and undated, was published. We can kind of get an idea, and some of the clues are actually in this picture of Thomas Peterson right here. See that medal that he's wearing? Okay, this is the voting medal that the citizens of Perth Amboy awarded him in 1884 in honor of his being the first Negro voter under the 15th Amendment. Notice Lincoln, that's supposed to be Abraham Lincoln. No beard. I thought that was kind of interesting. So we know that that happened May 30th, 1884. Okay? In this article, Peterson does not talk about the medal. Does not talk about receiving the medal. They go on, I mean, this program goes on to describe him being so honored, but it doesn't reference that article anymore. So we can perhaps guess that this article had to have been published prior to 1884. Maybe just before he was going to get the medal, or there was some controversy over whether he was the first voter or so on. So maybe somebody was interviewing him and talking to him, but he doesn't reference the medal. We know from the records Peterson was the janitor of school number 1, which is now named in his honor, between 1870 and 1877. He was awarded the medal in 1884, so we can say the article was probably published between 1877 and 1884. Does that make sense to everybody? Yes? Okay. There were 2 presidential election years within that period, 1880 and 1884. Now, 1884 is kind of an outlier. It's possible because there were conventions that may have been happening in 1883. Because remember, he talks about last year I was a delegate. If it was the 1880 presidential election, it was probably this one where James A. Garfield won as president, Chester A. Arthur won as vice president. His side won this one, though James Garfield would be assassinated within a year of his being elected. But that's a possibility. If it was 1884, he lost. The winners were the Democrats. His side fielded James G. Blaine and John Alexander Logan. If you don't recognize those names, it's because they lost. Though they gotta love the mustaches and the beard. Maybe it's that one. It could also be, okay, so the winner of 1884 were the Democrats. This is Grover Cleveland. You probably have heard of Grover Cleveland, less so Thomas Hendricks, vice president, we don't remember. It's also possible it was a convention having to do with New Jersey's governor. There were 3 gubernatorial elections within this space of time. 1878, George B. McClellan. 1881, George C. Ludlow. 1884, Leon Abbott. Now, these are all Democrats, so in that case, his side would have lost all 3 of them. But there were also, Senate seats and so forth. So there was a lot of elections going on. There would have been a lot of different conventions happening for Middlesex County. So it becomes kind of muddy to tell which election he was involved in. But we can at least say that because we have it from his own mouth, that he was this delegate. Now we know it could not have happened after 1886. The reason we know that is because of this article. This is the Bridgeton Evening News, a newspaper out of New Jersey, May 29, 1886. Thomas Peterson, the first colored man in the United States to vote after the ratification of the 15th Amendment, was present as a delegate for Perth Amboy and gave his reasons for leaving the Republican Party. They won't settle the wrong questions. They fool us every year, and I am done with them. He had joined the Prohibition Party. I love them anyway. Prohibition Party, they have been fielding presidential candidates since 1872. It's the oldest third party in the United States. He felt that the Republican Party was no longer representing his interests, and so he jumped ship. And this was considered newsworthy enough that it was mentioned in this newspaper. Now, who he would have been backing, this was a gubernatorial election, it's not a presidential election. Who they would have been backing was the Prohibition Party's candidate for governor of New Jersey, Clinton B. Fisk. Okay, you probably don't remember him because he lost. But Mr. Fisk actually has an interesting history. He was born in New York. He was an abolitionist, Civil War Union general and brigadier, assistant commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau for Kentucky and Tennessee, working to establish free schools throughout the South for both poor black and white children. He left an endowment of $30,000, founding Fisk University, a black college. He was a leader of the temperance movement. He was, at the time, you would have known who he was, but obviously he didn't win. Who did win was this gentleman, Democratic Party, Robert Stockton Green. So we know he was a delegate to Republican conventions for the county. He represented Perth Amboy. And we also know that he jumped ship and changed parties for the Prohibition Party, at least by 1886. Juror on Middlesex County Courts. This is the one I have the least evidence of. The primary source here is this publication. So on May the 30th, 1884, when they issued him, or when they gave him that medal for being the first Negro voter, this was published by Harold Pickersgill, a local historian and newspaper publisher. He published this account of the ceremony whereby Peterson was given this award. It's also worth noting that his mother was at this event, who had been a slave. So you can imagine how she must have felt to be sitting there, a former slave, and seeing her son recognized as being the first African-American voter under the 15th Amendment. This was a very proud moment. And I also note this, I love this. This is the only other representation of Peterson that we know of. That picture that I keep using, and that is actually over there in that cabinet over there, those are the only images that we have of Peterson that we know of right now. There may be others, we don't know. But this is Peterson, there's his medal. In this program, they talk about Peterson has been summoned to serve as a juror in the county courts. So again, this is a contemporary record, so we know it must be true because it's a contemporary record. It's been said, various references have considered him to be the first black juror, the first black juror in Middlesex County, first black juror from Perth Amboy. We don't really find any evidence to support that. It may be true, but there's no evidence to support it that we have been able to find to date. Now, people even here in the library have gone through all the newspapers looking for some kind of mention. I think it's telling that this is a publication honoring Peterson for being the first black voter under the 15th Amendment, and if they're going to mention him as a juror, if he was the first black juror of whatever, they probably would have mentioned it here. They don't. So I think that kind of, leans that he was a juror, he wasn't necessarily the first black juror of whatever. I think that's kind of been embellished. The story has been embellished a little bit as time went on. But I don't know. There may be evidence out there to support it. Now, when I was trying to find any evidence of that, I came across this newspaper. This is the Daily Times of New Brunswick, New Jersey, October 16th. This is 1896. And there's an article here that talks about a man from, I forgot what town he's from, but it's not important, he was being acquitted for burglary. And at the end of this article, they identify the jurors, and they talk about a Thomas Mundy. Now, he went by Thomas, in his lifetime, he went by Thomas Mundy, he went by Thomas Peterson. It's perfectly possible that this is our Tom Mundy, or it may not be. Because going through the census records, I also found, this is the following year, this is a New Jersey census, a Thomas Mundy in Raritan, a white man. But in those days, when they did the census records, if any of you have done research, you know this, when you get to a certain point, they don't give you the age of the person, they bin them. So in other words, if you're between this age and that age, you get a check mark. This Thomas Mundy was somewhere between 5 and 20 years old. Now, how old did you have to be at that time to serve on a jury? I don't really know that. If it was the upper end of the scale, then maybe this was the guy that was on the jury and not Thomas Mundy from Perth, Amboy. So again, this is one of those areas where it's still very ambiguous. There's not a lot of evidence. It's very hard to find. This is that article is the only reference I found to anybody by that name serving on a jury. I have gone to the county clerk's office I've contacted the county clerk's office and the county court in New Brunswick. They don't have records going back that far. So this is one of those things that it's still fuzzy. Ran for local political office. This one is kind of one of my favorites. Back in I think it was 2012, I was informed that there were 2 boxes of documents that had been deposited at City Hall in the Surveyor General's office. This is before, now it's all cleaned out. They want to make a museum in it, and I hope they get to do that. At the time, it was just being used for storage. And they said that, yeah, there were these 2 boxes. Somebody left them there full of all kinds of records and stuff, and it's in here. If you want to go through it, go ahead. Okay, great. So I got to go in there. I found all kinds of amazing stuff. This is the New York Herald newspaper from the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And what kind of struck me about this, look at this picture of Abraham Lincoln. Now, Abraham Lincoln, while he was president, had the beard. He's assassinated. They're representing him here in the paper. He doesn't have a beard. Remember the medal? I found that kind of striking. Anybody who is knowledgeable of the iconography of Abraham Lincoln might be able to explain why that is. I just found that kind of interesting. But this is what I was here to say. That was cool. I mean, there were other newspapers at the end of World War I and all that kind of stuff. This is the one that was interesting to me. These are the 2 boxes that contained stuff. All kinds of stuff. And if you are an historian, this is like catnip to a cat. I mean, this is just wonderful, wonderful stuff. These are receipts, these are letters, these are weird kind of, and from all different eras, mostly in the middle part of the 1800s. Absolutely, just in my element going through this. What I came across was this long piece of paper, everything kind of taped together. And this is the election results of an election happening the 18th of April, the year of our Lord, 1879. So this is an 1879 election results here in Perth, Amboy. Handwritten, no computers here. So this is the results of an election. They're electing the county clerk, they're electing aldermen, they're electing councilmen, they're electing various positions in the local government. And it's, okay, well, this is kind of interesting, this is kind of cool, you know. And I'm going down the list and I'm looking at the different people, the different posts and what their vote tallies were. And I get down here and all of a sudden I see this name. Thomas Mundy. So this is, the following year is the federal census. I go into that. I want to see, are there any other Thomas Mundys living in Perth Amboy at this time? Or maybe this is somebody else. Nope. The only Thomas Mundy that was living in Perth Amboy at the time is our Thomas Mundy. Thomas Mundy was running for office. He was running for councilman. He only got 2 votes, but he ran. Now, in special collections, Alexander Library in New Brunswick, again, this is the 1930s, WPA, they are transcribing Perth Amboy government records and they're typing them out, they're putting them in these books. This is a later version, this is covering 1844 to 1958. Awesome, let's see what's in here. So here is that same election, April the 8th, 1879, Thomas Mundy, 2 votes. Granted, he's still doing better than John Adair or Pat Carr. They just got 1 vote each, probably their own, so he's ahead of the game. But he's running, assuming that is him, and there is no reason to, right now at least, to think that it's not, he was running for councilman in 1879, 9 years after he cast his vote. So this is a whole new thing that I was not aware of. I don't know if anybody else was, but so Thomas Peterson, not only did he vote, not only was he a juror, not only was he a representative in these political conventions, he was running for office himself. Unsuccessfully, but he was running, and he was participating. Then I started flipping the pages, looking at some of the other election results. So this is actually going back in time. This is April the 12th, 1871. There was a Thomas Peterson running for constable of 2nd Ward. Now I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but 2nd Ward included Commerce Lane, Commerce Street, which is where he lived. Okay? What the other thing I found interesting here was, look at the letters that are after their name. We have R, presumably Republican, D, presumably Democrat, P, Prohibition. That article said he was Prohibition Party in 1886. So this kind of predates that, but still, it's kind of interesting. You know, I mean, okay, he got 45 votes. He did better than when he ran for council, right? April the 4th, 1888, Thomas Peterson pops up again, running for excise commissioner, tax enforcement position. 104 votes. Okay, again, you know, still not the winner, but hey, he did better than W.B. Mount, who only got 1. So, you know, he's doing okay. I mean, it's respectable. This was something that I didn't know. If this is the same Thomas Peterson, and looking at the census records, I don't have any reason to think that it's not, that there is another Thomas Peterson or Thomas Mundy in Perth Amboy at the same time, that this is a whole new aspect of his life and his career that a lot of people don't know, that he ran for political office. You know?
Did he mean by petition rather than the party?
Could be, could be, could be. So, again, I mean, obviously this is only part of the story, because we still have to go on 50 years later before women got the vote. We have to go on to the Civil Rights Acts and the Voting Rights Acts and everything that's going on now politically. But regardless of where you stand on issues like gerrymandering, like voter ID, like voter fraud, and all of these things, all of this is predicated on the assumption that suffrage and citizenship are one and the same thing. that concept that we take for granted now was something that Thomas Peterson could not take for granted. I like to say that the relationship between suffrage and citizenship was consummated when Thomas Peterson dropped his ballot into that ballot box here in Perth, Amboy, 147 years ago. But not only that, he embraced civic life. He understood and appreciated the opportunity and what that meant to him, to his race, to his country. He embraced that. And I think when you get into that part of the story, because again, this is Peterson. This isn't something that just happened to fall into his lap. This is him taking advantage of that opportunity. That to me is as much of his legacy as his vote. So thank you very much for your attention tonight. I'm going to get her first because she had a question before.
Yeah, something you said earlier there. Going back to the proof that he was or was a juror in the Middlesex County Courts.
Yes.
Where did you say the proof of that information came from?
So it was a pamphlet that was published by was it Thomas Pickersgill? I can get you the full name. It was published when they gave him the medal in 1884, May 30th, 1884, the medal in recognition of his being the first Negro voter. This was a program that was published which reproduced the speeches that were given and the ceremony and so on. So this was a statement where they were characterizing him and what he was doing in his life. This is one of the things that they mentioned. So this is a contemporary reference. They're saying at the time, in 1884, they're saying that he had been summoned as a juror. So that's why we can say that it happened, because it's a contemporary reference. It's not something that somebody assumed later on or inferred later on. This was in his lifetime.
Are copies of that pamphlet available anywhere, do you know?
I see. You have a copy here?
Pickersgill?
Pickersgill, yeah. I have. You have a copy here, or I actually found it at Rutgers, at Alexander Library. I don't know if it's online, but I do. That's where I found it. I have photocopies of it. I mean, you give me. Well, I think I have your email address. I can send you a copy of it if you would like. I'm happy to do that. Okay.
Very possibly it was in Dr. McGinnis's book also.
Yes. I mean, this was 1884, so that would predate McGinnis. He probably was referencing that. Mm-hmm. So you had a question.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, when you were researching his name in the census, did you research on the Mundy or Peterson, or was it both that was
Both.
there? Both showed up.
Yes.
I was just wondering why.
He appears as Thomas Mundy, and he appears as Thomas Peterson. He never appears as Thomas Mundy Peterson.
Yeah.
The closest we got was in that program when they gave him the medal in 1884. They referred to him as Thomas Peterson Mundy. The Mundy comes from when he was born in what is now Metuchen. I think at the time was still part of Woodbridge.
Yes.
And he was associated. His father worked for the Mundy family.
Exactly.
I don't find any record one way about any slave relationship or anything like that. At the point that the father is there, it appears to be an employer-employee relationship. I don't know beyond that. When Peterson, later in his life, now we talk about these newspaper clippings that are unidentified and undated. There's another one that was found by a historian, Walt Stachel, in Metuchen, that it's an interview with Peterson. He talks about being apprenticed to an Ezra Mundy back in what's down Metuchen. So obviously the relationship had to be something positive. You're not going to send your son back to apprentice with somebody who abused you or who you don't like. But the name kind of, that was common at the time, was part of it. What's interesting is later in his life, The property that he had on Commerce Street, when he was getting too old and he wasn't able to keep up with it, it was sold to St. Peter's Church. And if you look at the land records, up to a certain point in his life, suddenly he becomes Thomas H. Peterson. When he died, the record of his funeral arrangements from the undertaker is in the archives of St. Peter's. And it referred to him as Thomas H. Peterson. And somebody in pencil had crossed it out and put M.
Oh, wow.
But I know because on his death certificate, it's Thomas Henry Peterson. His father was Thomas Henry Peterson. So properly, his name is Thomas Henry Peterson, which is right. People refer to him as Thomas Mundy Peterson. I just refer to him as Thomas Peterson because that's his name. That was his name. He went by Tom Mundy. He went by Tom Peterson, but his real name is Thomas Henry Peterson.
I asked the question just because when he was running for two different
right.
things that you presented, it was under the two different last names.
Yeah, I noticed that too. Sometimes when he is dealing with white people, it's Tom Mundy, especially at a certain point in his life. I think because that's what people knew him as. They would recognize Tom Mundy. Okay, so he I don't know what the logic really was behind it, but that seems to be part of it. There was a familiarity with certain
Right.
names, and that he was using that to probably his advantage, trying to. Anyone else have any questions? You know more than you ever wanted to know. I put you all to sleep. Yes, ma'am.
In relationship to something else in history that has disturbed me, there's a woman named Elizabeth Jennings. Are you familiar with that name?
I don't think so.
Well, you can go on your computer and find it. She was a school teacher in New York City. And this is in the 1800s. She was on her way to church one Sunday and was forced off the trolleys so that someone white, a male white, could sit down. And she protested, but she was forced off anyway. And she then sought recourse. And there was a law firm in New York City that took the case pro bono. And Chester A. Arthur, our 21st president, was part of that law
Oh, that's
firm.
fascinating. Really?
Yes.
What was her name again? Jennings?
Elizabeth Jennings.
Elizabeth Jennings.
1864? 54, okay.
54. Wow.
Yes. And they won a landmark case against the New York Transit Authority.
Really? That's
Yes.
fascinating. I'm gonna have to look that one up.
Well, I'm telling you
Yeah.
the truth.
Yeah. Oh, I believe it.
I was there, don't worry.
Oh, I don't believe that.
So, anyway, that bothers me because we talk about, what's that woman's name?
Rosa Parks.
Rosa Parks.
Right.
I block her name out because it's so disingenuous.
Yeah.
This happened 100 years
Before that.
Rosa Parks.
Yeah.
And that's a fact. And nobody seems to know about
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
Nobody seems to know.
There seems to be a lot of.
I think she won $250 or something was
Yeah.
what she
That
got
was her-
out
that
of the
was her
settlement.
Oh, my.
But, well, back
Well,
then,
sure,
that
yeah,
was a
right.
big deal back then. But Chester A. Arthur was part of that firm, and he became our 21st president.
I did not know that. That is
Well,
fascinating.
it's a fact, look it up.
You know, I mean, yeah, I feel like there are these people, these characters in that history that we don't know about. We know the quote unquote big names, you know.
You know
and
the
it's
names
all-
that people
all the-
want you to know.
Yes,
That's what you know.
yeah, it's filtered,
Because
they filter history.
the week before Rosa Parks, there was a young woman in the South, I think probably might have been in the same area with Rosa Parks, who also was put off a bus. She was, I believe, 19 years old. And she just, they didn't want to make her prominent because She was a young black woman who was pregnant and unmarried. So she didn't fit into
Okay.
their, exactly.
Wow. That's interesting.
And there were others included that, but they make out that Rosa Parks was all of this, and it's just,
She's just one of
it
many.
bothers me.
Yeah.
Because 100 years before there was
Yeah.
Elizabeth Jennings.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That's I thank you. Anyone else have any questions? Well, you just.
More of a suggestion, I think that
Okay.
pursuing this issue of jury service
Yes.
is very important for a black man to sit on a jury, possibly in judgment on a white person. I would think there would have to be some press about that.
You would
or
think.
not.
I've not been, granted, what I've been doing has been what I can do from sitting in my office. So it's online searches of newspapers. There's a lot of digitized newspapers, not all of them. And as you know, there are papers from this area that don't exist, at least from that period, that we don't know of any extant copies of, certainly not digitized. So, and maybe some of these articles that I have not been able to track down are from what was the name of that paper?
The Chronicle or the Middlesex County Democrat.
Middlesex County Democrat, that was what it was, yeah. So there are these papers that were local papers that were here just for a short amount of time that there are not extant copies of, and certainly not digitized copies of. And maybe there was an interview somebody did with Peterson that is now, referenced bits and pieces in these other secondary sources, but we don't have the original newspapers.
There's no evidence that I've ever been able to uncover that Thomas Mundy Peterson's father was a slave. His mother was a slave.
Yes,
That's
I know.
documented.
Yes.
But the father worked for a family in Metuchen, which actually Metuchen was like a little donut inside of Woodbridge.
Yeah. I think at the time that they were there, it was still Woodbridge. It hadn't been carved out
Yeah, it
yet.
was still considered Woodbridge,
Yeah,
exactly.
because if you go back in the census records, it's still considered Woodbridge, yeah. Yeah, no, I did not find any references to that either. I mean, it's always possible that previous generations, the Mundy family goes back a long ways. So, who knows what in the past. But I know from all the evidence that we have, the relationship between the families seemed to have been friendly enough that they would adopt the name, that he would send, that the father would send his son back to be apprenticed with Ezra Mundy. You're not going to send your son back to somebody who is abusing you or who is, So,
And believe me, Woodbridge Township takes ownership of Thomas Mundy Peterson also.
Oh yeah. everybody wants a piece of time.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Doesn't it seem strange that in a time period where the law, the 15th Amendment was just passed, and now the years after, the years that he dealt with, that he would be able to do all these things, taking it wasn't the South, where you have the KKK and that kind of thing. But doesn't it seem strange that he would be able to participate in society so successfully?
It doesn't, because in Perth Amboy, and this is actually something I covered in the other talk I did, which that's a whole other thing. The things had to come together in order to make it go possible. I talk about Marcus Spring in that quote, or in the quote. He references Marcus Spring, Kearney. There was the Eagleswood Academy. Are you familiar with that at all? The Eagleswood Academy. The Raritan Bay Union. These were things that Rebecca Spring and Marcus Spring started. These were a combination of utopian communities, artist colonies, and schools. Incredibly progressive for their time. They believed in suffrage for women. They believed in equality for women. They believed in equality for races. They had mixed classes, both racially and gender-wise. To give you an idea of how involved these people were, what was it? I'm blanking out on the guy's name that.
Springard?
No, oh man. the attempted slave revolts.
The what?
Wasn't that Turner? Or no, it was something out here. John Brown. Thank you. Yeah, it's such a complicated name. How could I forget John Brown? Yes, John Brown. If you're familiar with that story. So after the Harper's Ferry raid failed, John Brown, and if they weren't killed, they were captured, and they were imprisoned in Virginia. Rebecca Spring, Marcus Spring's wife, who was a part of that Raritan Bay Union here in Perth Amboy, she went down there and she visited John Brown and his men in their prison cells. She administered to their wounds. She kept them company. When they were convicted and sentenced to hang, she was there. When two of the bodies remained unclaimed, two of the men that were involved in that raid remained unclaimed, she took possession of the bodies, snuck them into New Jersey, had them buried on the property of Eagleswood, where her and her husband had their home, and had them buried there in free soil. They were later moved to, I think it was splits in New York State. But yes, so that gives you an idea of how ardent these people were, and especially a woman at that time traveling alone to Virginia to administer to the wounds of black men and John Brown. That took guts. Yes. Okay? And then to take possession of and claim these unclaimed bodies to make sure that they were buried in free soil. And this school, this Raritan Bay Union School that later became the Eagleswood Academy, they taught a lot of people who ended up becoming the main movers and shakers in Perth Amboy's community. The politics, the business world. J.L. Carney, I mean, we know Carney from, Commodore Carney, the Carney Cottage. J.L. Carney was a product of that school. Of course, he was going to encourage, and Marcus Curlis worked he worked for Marcus Spring. Okay, so both of these men, and for those of you who weren't at the event that was this afternoon with John Dyke had, Marcus Curlis was the second black man to vote under the 15th Amendment here in Perth Amboy. He was involved evidently with the Underground Railroad, so there's a whole other history there as well.
I was just going to say, Eagleswood was also a safe haven for runaway slaves.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
The slave trade came here. Where the ferry slip is, they bring them in through there. And they traveled up and ended up at Eagleswood because it was a safe place for them.
So this was the environment that was in Perth Amboy at that time. So it's not that surprising when you know what the lay of life. Now, the other side of that is there was a story at the time that a white man saw Thomas Peterson voting and probably Marcus Curlis voting and tore up his ballot and said, well, if those people can vote, my vote is worth nothing. So, it wasn't entirely this panacea of, progressivism, but there was a very strong element of abolitionism, of, Negro suffrage. They were supportive of women's suffrage and so on. So, there was that influence happening at that time. And I feel like that was part of why Peterson got to do what he did. And the fact that they gave him the medal in 1884. And if you read that program of the speeches and everything, they're very paternalistic. And if you read them, there's some quotes in there that are kind of cringeworthy to us today. But at the same time, they were putting a medal on a guy's jacket for something that in another part of the country, they would have been putting a noose around his neck for. Yeah. So it's all relative. It's steps. It's progress taken in the context of his time. So it doesn't surprise me that he was able to do some of the things that he did. because of the environment that existed here in Perth Amboy. And again, I mean, I think it's something that Perth Amboy should be very proud of. It's something that makes it very unique for that time period.
May I say something?
Sure.
People don't realize the history of Perth Amboy and how we were more progressive than so many other parts of this country. There was so much that went on here that didn't happen elsewhere. And this was a place where you could grow and be appreciated as a human being,
Yeah.
as opposed to the color of your skin.
Mhm.
That's been my experience.
Anyone else have any questions? I see some tired faces here, so I think we're done. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
For those of you who don't know me, I'm Eleni Glikis. I'm the director of the Perth Amboy Free Public Library. I wanted to thank everybody for enduring kind of a long night and braving the bad weather to come out to learn about another one of Perth Amboy's firsts. This event would not be possible without acknowledging some of the people: the Library Board of Trustees, Perth Amboy's Audiovisual Department, the Department of Public Works, Buildings and Grounds, the City of Perth Amboy. Thank you, Councilman Helman Kaba and Fernando Irizarry for coming out. The Historic Preservation Commission, and of course Gordon Bond. And of course my staff in the back: Vilma Novak, David Mori, Edwin Oliveria, and Roberto Hernandez, worked tirelessly to help me organize everything. We hope that with this new knowledge, you join the Historic Preservation Commission in helping us secure the land on Commerce Street to properly acknowledge Thomas Mundy Peterson. Thank you all. There's some refreshments in the back. Thank you all for coming. Have a great night.